Rain has a way of drowning out the world. It smothers footsteps, buries whispers, and makes even the most violent sounds blur into nothing more than a faint echo behind the steady curtain of water. For centuries, people who lived in the wilderness feared the storm not only because it brought destruction, but because it gave cover to whatever might walk in the dark. A scream in the rain is a scream that never reaches a neighbor's ear. A breaking window in the storm is just another shudder against the wind. In silence, you are exposed. In heavy rain, you are invisible. And when the night swallows you whole, no one knows if you ever fought back. The story begins with that reminder. A house stood on the edge of a clearing, framed by dense trees and ridges of shadow that seemed to bend toward it each time the clouds shifted. It was not the kind of house meant for visitors. It was a house that wanted to be forgotten, its roof dark with moss, its wood damp from seasons of storms. From a distance it looked like a speck of light against an ocean of black forest, fragile and alone. People who drove past rarely slowed down. They told themselves they were too busy, that the road was dangerous in the rain. But deep down they felt something heavier, that to linger near that house too long was to be noticed by something waiting. Inside, the rain became a constant pulse, like an unending drumbeat against the glass. The walls seemed to breathe with it, shivering each time the wind pressed too close. Whoever sat within those walls would never feel truly at rest. Each creak of the wooden beams felt alive, as though the house was whispering to itself. Every shadow stretched too far, as if it carried weight. Even the fire, meant to offer warmth, seemed pale in the face of the storm. There is a saying whispered in rural towns, one that lingers long after the telling. A storm hides what you do not want to see. For some, that is comfort, the idea that grief, shame, or sins might be swallowed by thunder and rain. But for others, it is terror. Because if the storm hides what you do not want to see, what else does it shelter? What else moves freely when eyes are blind and ears are deafened by water hammering the earth? The night it began, the storm was heavier than usual. The clouds dragged across the sky like torn fabric, stretching the moonlight thin. The trees swayed like bodies in a silent ritual, bowing to the weight of the wind. And through it all came a sound that should not have risen above the rain. A knock, 3 slow heavy strikes against a wooden door, not frantic, not desperate, patient, measured, as though whoever stood outside knew that time itself belonged to them. Inside, silence followed. The only thing louder than the rain was the pause between those knocks. It was the kind of pause that filled the lungs with dread before a single word could be spoken. There were stories of strangers who knocked in storms. Travelers, they said. Lost hunters. Injured hikers. But those stories never lingered on how they found the strength to reach a door that sat miles from the nearest road, through forests that swallowed paths and rivers that split the ground. To arrive at such a house was no accident. To knock upon its door in the storm was not a plea. It was a choice. The door never opened that night. The sound of the storm carried on, relentless and merciless, until the moon began to vanish behind rolling clouds. And yet the family inside swore they still heard something on the porch long after the knocking stopped. Slow footsteps dragging from one end to the other. A presence that leaned close enough to press weight against the wood. The faint scrape of fingernails, perhaps, or the edge of something sharper, dragging against the window pane. They did not move. They did not speak. They told themselves it was wind, that branches had fallen, that rain distorted sound. But when the morning came, their eyes fell to the ground outside the door, and the truth washed through them with a coldness deeper than the storm itself. The soil was soft with rain. Every step a person might take would leave its imprint. But in the mud, only one set of prints remained, circling the house in wide arcs, pausing at each window, each wall, as if searching for the weakest point. The steps were deep, pressed down with the weight of something heavy, almost deliberate. And then they vanished, leading back into the forest where the shadows were still thick. No trail forward, no return to the road, only silence. What do you do when someone comes for you in the rain? When sound is drowned and light is swallowed and every proof of their presence is erased by morning? What do you believe when the only evidence they leave is just enough to remind you that you were never imagining it? The storm returned the next night. And so did the knocking. The house had not always been alone. Decades earlier, when the forest was still young and the dirt road still felt freshly carved, there had been a scattering of other homes not far from it. Families once tried to settle this pocket of woodland. Lured by fertile soil, steady rainfall, and the promise of solitude, they built their lives with bare hands, raising cabins from the timber around them, carving small fields between the trees, and telling themselves that a hard life close to nature would reward them with peace. But peace was never steady here. The storms came too often. The earth flooded. Bridges washed out, paths were buried in mudslides, and roads grew impassable in the rains. One by one, families left. Roofs sagged, windows shattered, and those cabins collapsed beneath moss and time, all except one. The last house stood because someone always returned to repair it. Each generation, one family remained, carrying the weight of a place others had abandoned. Locals spoke of them with a strange mixture of respect and suspicion, as if their decision to remain marked them both as resilient and cursed. No one understood why they stayed when every storm left deeper scars, but the story was always the same. The house was never truly empty. When one fell, another took their place, the walls patched, the fires lit, the windows watched. The forest around it carried its own reputation. Old hunters swore that the trees moved differently here, that the wind carried voices not heard in other valleys. There were stories of missing animals, of horses bolting in the middle of the night, of dogs refusing to cross the clearing when thunder began to roll. Children dared one another to approach the porch, but few ever touched the steps. They said the boards groaned like something alive, that to stand on them was to be recognized as though the house itself knew you were there. For the family who lived inside, it was never so simple as leaving. Their roots were buried here in a way no storm could wash away. The land had taken pieces of them already. Generations lost to illness, accidents, and tragedies whispered in town, but never spoken aloud in their presence. The house became less a choice and more a bond, a tether to something they did not fully understand yet could not cut free from. To abandon it was to admit it held more power than they did. To remain was to believe survival was possible, even if it came at a cost. In the nearest town, just miles away but separated by twisting dirt roads, people avoided speaking of that house directly. It was easier to pretend it belonged to no one. Easier to say it was simply another cabin in the forest, another relic of a time when people thought they could tame the wild. And yet every time a storm swept through, lights could be seen flickering from its windows, a reminder that someone still endured within, a reminder that, even if no one admitted it, the house was not forgotten. For those who lived inside, life was measured by storms. Summer rains were harsh but survivable. The fall storms were worse, bending trees until their roots lifted, rattling the walls until dishes fell from their shelves. And winter storms carried the most weight. When snow and rain mixed and the wind howled like a voice searching for entry, children learned to count thunder not as a game, but as a way to mark the silence between each strike. Adults learned to patch roofs in the night, to hold lanterns steady when the power flickered, to never mistake a knock for help. There had always been knocks. That was the part no one spoke about in daylight. For as long as the house stood, there had been stories of someone or something coming to its door when the rain fell hardest. Some knocks were explained away. Strangers caught in the weather, a lost traveler, even a storm-swelled tree branch bending against the wood. But not all could be dismissed. The ones that lingered in memory were those that carried patience, the ones that sounded like ritual, always three, always spaced apart as if marked by a rhythm older than the storm itself. The family learned silence as defense. To open the door was to invite what they did not wish to face. To answer was to acknowledge it existed, and so with each generation silence was taught as survival. Children were told stories of wolves at doors, of thieves seeking refuge, but underneath the tales was the truth their parents did not want to speak. That the storm carried visitors who belonged neither to the town nor the woods, and if they were ignored, they might simply vanish back into the rain. But silence did not erase memory. The weight of each night remained, carried in glances between family members when the next storm rolled in, carried in the way their hands shook when the windows rattled, carried in the way their eyes moved toward the porch long after the rain had stopped, and when neighbors spoke in hushed voices about why the family remained in that house when all others had abandoned the valley, those who lived within it already knew the answer. They stayed because leaving was not escape. The house was bound to them and they to it. The storm was not only outside, it lived within the walls. As the years passed, the family grew smaller. Some left, swearing never to return. Some vanished without explanation. Some endured, patching the wood, lighting the lamps, and waiting for the next storm. Each believed, or perhaps hoped, that what haunted the clearing might fade with time. But the knocks never faded. They came, steady and patient, as certain as rain itself. And each time they echoed through the walls, the family was reminded that the house was not alone. That was the truth that weighed on them most. They were not isolated by choice. They were not hidden by chance. They were watched, and the storm was not what they should have feared most. The storm that returned was not unusual at first. It carried the same thick clouds that pressed down upon the forest, the same rhythm of rain against the roof, the same wind that seemed to whisper through every gap in the wood. For those who lived in the house, it was familiar, an old threat that had visited countless times before. Yet familiarity did not bring comfort. It was the kind of storm that filled the air with weight, as if the forest itself was waiting. On the first night, the rain began early, long before dusk. The clearing was swallowed in mist, the trees blurring into shadow. Inside, the lamps were lit, their glow soft against the gloom. But the longer the storm carried on, the heavier the silence grew within the house. Conversations faded, movements slowed. The family seemed to listen without admitting it, their eyes shifting toward the door even when no sound had yet come. It was not a matter of if, it was only a matter of when. The knock came later that night, faint at first, almost swallowed by the rain. 3 strikes, measured steady, just as it had always been described. The pause that followed stretched like a held breath. No one moved. No one spoke. The air itself seemed to wait for an answer. Then, after long silence, another 3 strikes echoed against the wood, sharper this time, as though whoever stood outside knew they were being ignored. They did not open the door. They sat in silence until the fire burned low and the storm began to thin. But when morning came, they found the marks. Across the wet glass of the kitchen window, faint streaks cut downward as though someone had dragged their fingers across it. Too high for a child, too wide for a bird, too deliberate for the branches outside. They told themselves it was nothing more than water trails, a trick of the storm. But deep down they knew the difference between rain and intent. The second night grew worse. The storm did not ease but instead deepened, carrying a violence that rattled the beams and bent the trees. The house shuddered as though something pressed against it from all sides. This time the knocking began earlier, long before the lamps were dimmed. 3 strikes, silence, 3 more. And then footsteps, slow, dragging, circling the porch. The boards creaked under the weight, each step a reminder that someone or something remained. The family sat together in the main room, lanterns drawn low, as if dimming the light would keep them unseen. They heard the sound of breathing, faint but steady, pressed close to the door as if someone waited inches away. Then a scrape, metal against wood, long and deliberate, carving its own rhythm into the storm. By morning, the soil revealed the same strange truth as before. Deep footprints circling the house, pausing beneath each window. Some led toward the tree line, but again they vanished. No path through the forest. No return to the road. The rain should have washed them away, but it did not. Each step was pressed clear, as if the storm itself had chosen to preserve them. When the family turned to the town for help, their words fell into the same silence that had haunted generations before. Neighbors shook their heads, muttered about tricks of the storm, and urged them not to linger on it. But their eyes betrayed what their words would not. They knew the stories. They had heard them since childhood. They only chose not to speak, because speaking meant acknowledging that the house was not alone. The third night brought something new. The knocks came as always, 3 strikes against the door, but this time they did not stop. After the pause, a voice rose, faint, muffled by the rain. It carried no clear words, only a tone that pressed through the walls, low and persistent, like someone whispering from beneath water. The sound slid across the house, moving from one wall to the next, as though circling the family where they sat frozen. Each time it neared a window, the glass seemed to hum, vibrating as if pulled by the voice. The storm roared louder, drowning nearly everything, but still the whisper remained steady and patient. No one opened the door. They clung to their silence, to the rule that had carried them this far, yet silence brought no safety now. Sleep fled from them, replaced with long hours of waiting, ears straining against the storm. The house felt alive with presence, each beam groaning as if it bore not only the weight of the rain but of something unseen pressing against it. By dawn they were hollow with exhaustion, their eyes bloodshot, their voices thin. The storm ended, but its shadow remained within them. What unsettled them most was not only the presence outside, but the way it seemed to grow bolder each night. What had once been distant now pressed closer. What had once been silent now carried a voice. The family began to realize that the storm was not a passing threat. It was a siege, and still contradictions lingered. One neighbor swore he had heard screaming from the clearing during the second night, yet the family insisted they never spoke. Another claimed to see light flashing from the windows as if someone walked with a lantern through the rooms, though the family said they sat in darkness. The accounts did not align, each detail twisting against the other, leaving nothing certain except for fear itself. That was how the mystery grew. Not in sudden violence, not in the obvious presence of danger, but in the quiet corrosion of truth. The storm carried more than water. It carried contradiction. It carried confusion. And in the spaces between each unanswered question, dread seeped deeper until even the silence inside the house became unbearable. The storm was not finished. It was only beginning to speak. Morning light did not bring comfort. It only revealed more questions. After each night of knocking, after each whisper seeping through the storm, the house bore new scars. The family rose with dread and found marks that no explanation could easily erase. Scratches that cut into the wooden door wide and deep, as though pressed by something sharper than nails. Glass fogged not by the storm but by prints, streaks trailing downward as if a hand had lingered there for too long. On one window, 3 distinct smudges remained, uneven and spread too far apart to belong to a human palm. They wiped the glass clean, but the impression stayed etched in their minds, more permanent than any stain. The footprints were the clearest evidence. Each morning they discovered new tracks pressed deep into the softened soil, circling the house with deliberate patience. They were too large to belong to a child, too heavy to be dismissed as a stray animal. The edges of each print sank sharply, almost as if whoever left them carried more weight than a body should. The strangest detail was their clarity. In rain that devoured every trace of a wagon or cart within minutes, the prints remained untouched, preserved with unnatural precision. Some led toward the forest, yet none emerged, as though the storm itself sealed whatever path had been taken, leaving only a circle of presence closed and unbroken. In town, people shook their heads when these details were whispered. Some claimed storms distort the earth, that shadows of branches could mark glass, that soil shifts beneath constant rain. But even as they spoke, their voices carried unease. A man who once worked as a tracker studied the prints and admitted they did not match anything he had seen. Too long in stride, too uneven in depth, too consistent in their circling. He warned the family not to follow them, not to search for where they might lead. Some paths are not meant to be walked twice, he said, refusing to look at them again. The family gathered every clue they could, desperate to understand. They noted the timing. Always 3 knocks, always spaced apart. They listened to the whispers, straining for words but never heard language, only tones, as if the sound was imitating speech without meaning. One night, when the whisper pressed closer to the window, they thought they heard their own names repeated faintly, twisted by the storm until syllables blurred into water. But the moment they tried to listen harder, the voice broke apart, collapsing back into the rain. There were artifacts as well. On the 3rd morning, they found a small object on the porch, a shard of bone, smooth and pale, resting just beyond the threshold. It did not belong to any animal they recognized. Too clean, too deliberate, left not as debris carried by wind, but as an offering, or perhaps a warning. On another morning, a strip of cloth clung to the splintered edge of the porch railing, soaked through but strangely intact. It was dark in color, rough in texture, and when they brought it inside to dry, it left the air smelling faintly of rot. They burned it in the fire, but the smoke that rose carried an acrid bitterness that clung to the walls long after the flames had died. Experts offered no solace. One neighbor convinced himself that stress explained everything. That isolation in storms could fracture the mind. That exhaustion blurred sound into whispers. That fear carved meaning into meaningless shapes. A local doctor agreed, pointing to exhaustion and anxiety. The mind bends when it cannot rest, he said. It invents what it dreads the most. Yet even he could not explain the prints in the soil, or the bone on the porch, or why a family that clung to silence for generations now trembled at shadows. Another voice rose from further away, an old historian who studied folklore in the region. When he was told of the 3 knocks, his expression hardened. He spoke of ancient warnings, of patterns that marked not entry but invitation. 3 knocks was not always a request to be let in, he said quietly. In older stories, it was a claim, a marking of presence, a way of saying, I am here, and you already belong to me. His words sank into them heavier than the storm itself. He could not explain the footprints or the whispers, but he believed. And belief carried its own terror. Conflicting theories only deepened the wound. Were the knocks a human trick? The act of some cruel wanderer hiding in the forest, playing with their fear? Were the footprints distorted by rain? The objects on the porch scattered debris mistaken for symbols? Or was it true that something older lingered in that valley? Something that used the storm as its veil, circling the house the way vultures circle what is already claimed. No explanation fit completely. Each left gaps wide enough for dread to slip through. At night, as the storm began again, the family sat with these thoughts gnawing at them. Their eyes searched the windows, their ears strained for the knocks. Each clue they gathered did not arm them. It disarmed them further, stripping away every illusion of safety. They began to realize that evidence was not proof. It was reminder that the presence outside knew them well enough to leave traces, but never enough to be revealed. And so the storm pressed on, carrying its secrets. The knocks would come again, the whispers would rise, and by morning there would be new scars, new marks, new fragments of something circling just beyond their reach. The mystery was not fading. It was tightening, drawing them inward, one unanswered clue at a time. Fear does not arrive all at once. It seeps in slowly like water through cracks in a wall, until every surface is damp and heavy with it. By the 4th storm, the family inside the house no longer looked at one another with ease. Their eyes shifted nervously, tracing every movement, every breath, as if even the sound of their own blood was too loud in the silence. They had survived storms before, but these nights had changed something fundamental. The house was no longer a shelter. It had become a waiting room, a place where dread sat beside them like an uninvited guest, never speaking yet never leaving. The children grew quiet first. Where they once whispered questions during thunder, now they sat in silence. Their small hands clenched into fists, their bodies curled against the wooden floor as if making themselves smaller might make them invisible. They stopped asking what the sounds were. They stopped looking toward the door. Children adapt quickly, but the way they adapt is cruel. They did not hope for safety anymore. They expected fear. It became routine, a pattern as steady as the storm itself. The adults suffered differently. Exhaustion hollowed their eyes. Every hour of waiting in the dark carved lines into their faces. They no longer slept in shifts because sleep itself betrayed them. Dreams brought whispers back into their ears, vivid and close, as if the voice outside had found its way beneath their skulls. One of them admitted quietly that they woke with the taste of water in their mouth, as if rain had been poured down their throat while they slept. Another swore they heard footsteps in the hall at night, even though every door remained locked and no one else stirred. These were not stories they shared willingly. They slipped out in fragments, spoken in tones so faint they could be mistaken for thought rather than confession. The fear infected their bodies. Meals went unfinished. The sound of cutlery scraping plates made them flinch. The air inside thickened with unease, carrying the scent of damp wood, smoke, and sweat. Shadows stretched across the walls longer than they should, bending with each flicker of the fire, and each shadow was watched with suspicion. When thunder rolled, they jumped not from the sound itself, but from the silence that followed, the unbearable pause where they waited for 3 slow knocks to answer it. Trust began to wither. Each creak of the house was met with glances, not toward the door but toward one another. Who would falter first? Who would break the silence and open the door, drawn by fear or madness or some pull they could not resist? It was no longer the unseen visitor alone that haunted them. It was the possibility that the danger would rise from within. Paranoia spread like a second storm, one not carried by clouds but by suspicion. The children whispered less, but they listened more. Their eyes followed the adults, searching for cracks in their composure. One night, when the knocking began earlier than usual, a child asked in a voice barely audible, "What if it already came in?" The words froze the room. No one answered. No one could. Isolation thickened the weight of it all. The nearest town might as well have been another world. The roads were mud and ruin, and even if they could have left, where would they go? No one wanted to listen. No one wanted to help. And deep down, None of them could shake the sense that leaving the house would not save them. The storm followed. The presence followed. It was not bound to the clearing. It was bound to them. The rain grew louder in their heads. They began to hear it even when it had stopped, a phantom echo filling their ears. The rhythm of the 3 knocks repeated in their bones, a pulse that beat beneath their skin. They counted heartbeats against it, convinced at times that their own bodies had been forced into its rhythm. The storm had become part of them. The fear had become part of them, and there was no undoing it. What frightened them most was not death but the loss of themselves. They felt it happening in fragments, each night stripping away a layer. Laughter had vanished first, then conversation, then rest. What remained was a fragile shell of survival, thin enough to break at the slightest touch. They were alive, but life had become an echo of itself, hollow and trembling. Outside, the visitor remained patient. It did not break down the door. It did not force itself through windows. It did not need to. The family was unraveling without a hand laid upon them. Fear was more efficient than violence. It was more precise than any blade. It turned them against themselves, against each other, against their own minds. By the 5th storm, they realized the truth too late. Survival was not measured in how long the house stood, but in how long they could endure before they broke. And still, the knocking came. Always 3, always patient, always waiting for the moment when silence inside would fracture, when one voice would betray the rest. When the family finally reached for help beyond their small town, they carried with them more than fear. They carried fragments of evidence, scratches on wood, soil impressions, bone fragments, and whispers burned into their memory. They wanted someone to explain what they could not. But explanation, they learned, can be more terrifying than silence. The first to arrive were the authorities, summoned reluctantly. They trudged through the mud with boots heavy and shoulders hunched, more irritated than concerned. To them, the story was nothing more than nerves stretched thin by storms. They examined the soil, bent over the deep prints that circled the house, and dismissed them as distorted by rain. They studied the door, the long scratches that sank into the grain, and called them marks of branches hurled by wind. The bone fragment was carried away in a bag, and no word was returned. What remained behind was not assurance, but an emptiness deeper than before. For what the family heard in their tone was not dismissal born of certainty. It was fear disguised as skepticism. Rumors began to drift. Some claimed the family was inventing the story for attention, desperate for sympathy in a community that had grown tired of their endurance in a place others had abandoned. Others whispered that the family was hiding something darker, that the knocks on the door were echoes of their own secrets clawing for release. But the sharpest rumors came from the oldest voices in town. They spoke quietly, almost reluctantly, about the history of the valley, about patterns that stretched back further than memory. The valley, they said, had always been heavy with presence. Long before cabins were built, before dirt roads cut through the forest, the land carried weight. Travelers avoided it. Hunters never lingered. The storms came not as weather but as warnings. Folklorists who heard of the story were drawn in. They connected the 3 knocks to older myths, tales of spirits that announced themselves not for mercy but for claim. In such stories, the knock was never random. It was ritual. It meant the boundary between the inside and the outside had already been crossed, whether the door was opened or not. They spoke of the whispers as mimicry, the attempt of something ancient to take form in human memory, bending the rain into the shape of language. None of it provided proof, but it stitched fear into patterns too precise to ignore. Psychologists offered their own perspective. They called it collective delusion, a shared descent into paranoia brought by isolation, exhaustion, and the unending presence of storms. The knocks, they argued, were natural sounds twisted into rhythm by tired minds. The footprints were the shapes people wanted to see in chaos. Even the bone, they said, could be explained as coincidence, an animal remnant mistaken for omen. Yet when pressed, none of them could explain why the family's fear was so uniform, why each member described the events with the same details, why silence inside the house carried the same weight as sound. Investigators returned once more, this time under the weight of curiosity more than duty. They camped in the clearing one night, setting up lamps and watching the house from a distance as the storm rolled in. For hours, nothing happened beyond rain and thunder. Some laughed, muttering about tricks of the mind. But then the knocking began. Faint, measured, carried through the storm. The investigators heard it. They swore later that the sound did not come from wood, but from something deeper, as though the very air was being struck. And then the lamps around them flickered, shadows bending in ways that did not match their sources. When morning came, the prints were back in the soil, circling not just the house, but the tents where the investigators had slept. They never returned. Their reports vanished into silence, and their names were spoken with unease by those who knew them. Theories multiplied, each one more desperate than the last. Some believed a stalker had chosen the house using the storm as cover, tormenting the family until madness consumed them. Others believed the house itself was cursed, that the storms were drawn to it as a stage where the same story played endlessly, each generation carrying the weight of the last. And others, the ones who spoke in low voices only after dark, believed the truth was not human at all. They spoke of an older presence, one that did not break in because it did not need to, one that belonged to the storm, using it as both voice and veil. One that was not patient because it was not waiting. It had already entered. The investigations ended with no conclusion. Reports gathered dust. Authorities dismissed the case as inconclusive. Folklorists wrote papers that few read. The family was left with what they already knew. No explanation would come. Theories only shifted the burden of fear from one shape to another, but never removed it. And still the storm returned. The knocks came again. The prints deepened. The whispers grew clearer. Every attempt to define it only revealed more gaps, more contradictions, more evidence that the presence outside or within would never allow itself to be named. That was the cruelest part of all. Not that the mystery remained, but that each effort to explain it only bound it tighter to the family, to the house, to the clearing in the storm. The storms never stopped. That was the detail people remembered most when they spoke of the house in the clearing. The storms rolled through season after season, year after year, as steady as breath, as patient as time. Each one arrived with the same weight, the same rhythm, the same promise. And with them came the knocks. Always 3. Always measured. Always waiting for silence inside to break. The family endured, but endurance was not survival. They had become shadows of themselves, living bodies hollowed by fear, eyes empty with sleeplessness. They no longer spoke of escape. Escape suggested there was somewhere beyond reach, somewhere untouched. They had learned that there was no such place. The storm did not belong to the clearing alone. It carried itself within them in the rhythm of their pulse, in the whispers that clung to the edge of hearing even when the sky was clear. The storm had seeped into their bones, and there was no leaving it behind. Neighbors told stories long after. They spoke of nights when they passed near the valley and swore they saw light glowing faintly from the windows, though no one lived there anymore. They claimed the glow was not steady, but flickered in shapes too fluid to belong to fire. Some said the lights moved through the trees themselves, as if lanterns swayed in the branches where no human hand could carry them. Others swore that when the rain grew heavy, they heard knocks carried on the wind, faint but clear, echoing even miles away. They did not go closer. They only listened, and then they hurried on. The house still stood, though no one repaired it. The roof sagged, the porch boards bent, the windows clouded with grime, and yet it did not collapse, as if the storm itself preserved it, unwilling to let it rot, unwilling to let its walls fall. It remained a vessel waiting, enduring. The door that had carried the weight of countless knocks still hung in place, scarred and grooved but unbroken. It was a door that knew more than any person who passed through it, a door that had stood between the living and something that did not need entry to claim what it wanted. For those who dared to step close in daylight, the clearing felt wrong. The air grew heavier. The silence pressed deeper. Even the birds seemed to avoid the trees around it. Some who visited swore they felt watched, not from the house but from the storm clouds that gathered above, even when the rest of the sky remained clear. A single patch of darkness lingering, waiting for the first drop of rain. Theories continued, whispered and written and forgotten and reborn. Scholars debated folklore, scientists dismissed testimony, storytellers layered truth with invention, but none of it changed the reality that the house endured. None of it changed the fact that storms still came, and that people who lived close enough to hear swore the knocks returned with them. Each theory sought to explain, to cage the unexplainable in words. But the storm had no use for words. It moved with patience. It moved with certainty. It did not care for what people believed. The last time anyone stayed in the house was a traveler, someone who thought the story was nothing more than myth. They laughed when they entered, laughed when they lit a lantern, laughed when the rain began to fall. They said they would prove that nothing waited there, that fear belonged only to those too weak to face it. Their voice carried out the windows as the storm thickened, confident and unshaken, but when the knocks came, the laughter stopped. 3 slow, steady strikes against the door. Silence followed, thick as water. Then another 3, heavier this time. No voice answered. No sound followed. By morning, the lantern still burned inside, but the house was empty. The traveler never walked out. Their boots remained by the door, wet with rain. Stories ripple outward like water. Each retelling changes shape, bends the truth, but carries the same current beneath. What lingers is not the detail of who vanished or when, not the scratches on wood or the prints in soil, but the pattern. 3 knocks, a whisper through rain, a silence that weighs heavier than any sound. That is what survives, what grows, what binds itself to memory until it becomes impossible to tell whether it was lived or imagined. And that is why the story still unsettles those who hear it. Because storms are not rare. Because rain falls everywhere. Because anyone can find themselves sitting in silence, listening as water presses against windows, as the house groans in the wind, as shadows stretch longer in the flickering light. And in that silence, they wonder, what if they hear it? 3 slow knocks against the door. The house in the clearing remains, waiting. The storm remains, circling. And perhaps the presence remains too, patient and unhurried. Perhaps it has already left the valley. Perhaps it waits somewhere closer, carried on the clouds, ready to press its weight against new walls, to whisper through new windows, to mark new souls with silence. The question lingers, steady as thunder before the strike. When the storm comes for you, when the knocks rise through the rain, will you recognize them as sound, or will you know them for what they are? An invitation you cannot refuse. And when the silence answers, will you dare to listen?